Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Arthur Spirling, Professor of Political Science at Princeton University. Arthur works at the intersection of political science and data science and previously held a joint appointment in these fields at NYU, which is where we met each other and where he grew the Masters in Data Science program at the NYU Center for Data Science. Arthur, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
It's wonderful to be here.
Here we are sitting in Princeton in your office. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get here?
Yeah, so I have been at Princeton for 2 months. And prior to that, I was a professor at NYU, where I had a joint appointment in politics and data science. And prior to that, I had my first job at Harvard University. And prior to that, I was doing my PhD at the University of Rochester. And I have been in the United States for about 20 years. And prior to that, I lived in the UK.
So, I associate you as someone who is sort of in political science, but also in data science, and you were at the Center for Data Science, and you actually ran the master's program in data science that I want to talk to you at some point later in the conversation. But how did you fuse those two? Where did you get started? And, did you start getting computing or in politics?
I am a political scientist, and I'm very proud that that is first and foremost what I do. So I'm interested in how people make political decisions, especially elites. So how politicians make political decisions and how they function inside institutions. I specialized when I was in grad school in thinking about what we call methodology, which is our version of econometrics or a version of statistics. And the specific set of problems I was interested in were connected to measurement. So how we think about where people are on some ideological line, or how we think about state capacity, or how we think about how to measure how voters think about politicians. And it turns out that one of the main ways that we want to do that is using text. And this led me to have these interests in NLP, so natural language processing. And that led to a series of, and has led to a series of collaborations with folks in computer science particularly.
So what was your background in computing prior to text happening? So, you said you're a political scientist.
Yeah.
Where did the computing come in?
That's a good question. I'd always had an interest in it, but I have had relatively little technical training in computer science or data science. I mean, I have this observation actually about data science in general, which is that almost no one who is currently teaching data science has ever themselves taken a data science class because it's such a new discipline. So the classes that I had taken were in things like maximum likelihood estimation, probability, basic statistics classes. And I had developed an interest in computation and data science, mostly through application and some self-teaching, and through being exposed to co-authors who are using these techniques. And thus I had to kind of learn myself how they worked and what we're trying to do with them.
So, you talked about measurement earlier, right? Like the need to measure these things, what people think about politicians. Yeah. So what did measurement in political science consist of before the world of data?
Yes. So we've always been measuring things. I think that what I would say is that, and we've always done it with data, they were often crude and ad hoc measures. So we would put together indices where we would simply add different indicators of democracy or something like this and try to make sense of them. But the big change during my career...
But was this via surveys?
Some surveys, yes, and some surveys of say, voters or surveys of experts who are commenting on various countries. But the big change in my lifetime, or my career certainly, has been the extraordinary explosion of unstructured text that's been available, especially since the advent of the web. So I don't, and people often think we're just talking about social media, but we're not. We're talking about things like, news reports, government press releases, this extraordinarily large amount of data that we have to make systematic in some sense. And the other thing that has happened during my career is an explosion of archival content online. When I was, early in my career, it was very difficult in general to, say, get digitized records of parliaments, how people were talking to each other. But now it's, while not trivial for every country, there are extraordinary resources that are available to start harvesting. And that's been just such a shift in my lifetime.
And so when was this kind of inflection point? Because I remember, when the internet was emerging, I thought data was just around the corner. I mean, and I happened to be on Wall Street at the time when the internet was emerging, and I was into data. I was like, well, it's around the corner. I thought it'd be a few years, and it was about maybe 15 years. Yeah. So when was this inflection point where text just started becoming available in gobs?
That's a great question. So certainly by the early 2000s, I remember around 2008, 2009, 2010, we started to see some very large digital collections of texts pertaining to governments. There was also simultaneously optical character recognition got better, and I noticed colleagues were beginning to put online things that they were going to the archives, and they were scanning documents and putting those documents online, and so suddenly there were these big collections available. But I would say it seemed to occur around when I was in grad school, though, of course, when I was in grad school was around the time I started looking very intensely for these things. But that was about the time that lots of data started to become available.
So, I remember you were one of the early people that started looking at sort of text as data in this sort of political space. Yeah. So where did you get started, and what have we learned so far from sort of the availability of data in terms of, how we measure how people feel about politicians, how politicians communicate with people? Like, what have we learned through this data?
Right. I can divide this into sort of several different substantive areas. So certainly something that people are very active with in political science is it's not a field that I work in, but people are very interested in polarization, how it occurs, how it's maintained, somewhere like the United States, and how do we perhaps decrease polarization. And they have been, a particular debate there has been on refining our understandings of echo chambers or bubbles in terms of how people interact with social media, and trying to see what happens when people are exposed to content from outside their bubble or echo chamber, trying to see who is most susceptible to sharing false stories, where these false stories come from, and so on. And that's a very large literature. And my understanding in general is that people who share false stories who are susceptible to seeing these false stories tend to be particularly older voters, and that the world is not as siloed as we may fear. And so in some sense, polarization continues to exist despite the fact that people are not in media bubbles as much as we might fear. Now, simultaneously, the other thing that people have been working on is just looking at messages or information that voters receive. And so there's been lots of, discussion of how politicians choose to communicate, the styles that they adopt in social media, the way that institutions have emerged historically from by looking at archives. And so, just really runs the gamut in terms of the types of problems people have been interested in.
So is it becoming harder for people to trust what they're seeing and hearing these days?
My understanding is that the answer is yes, in the sense that we have we have a much more fragmented media environment. So if I think about even just heuristically during my own lifetime, when I was a child, there were one or two news stations. Now, even in the UK, I'm sure, you can have access to many, many news stations, and there seems to be some relaxation around how politically neutral they need to be. So yes, there has been concern about the idea of fake stories, fake images. Although I say that, and I have several colleagues who work on trying to estimate the effect of deep fakes. So this idea of putting together computerized, non-real images of politicians doing various things or famous people doing various things, and their general conclusion seems to be that it's no worse than anything else that's thrown at voters. So although we may be concerned that it's going to sort of sway voters, it doesn't itself seem to sway them. Not necessarily that voters can tell the difference between something that's real and fake, but that it of itself, just in the broader media environment, doesn't seem to affect people's minds too much. They seem to have their minds made up by other things that are going on.
I was reading an article where, they were talking about last April after Biden announced his re-election campaign, that the Republican National Committee responded with its own 30-second advertisement, which envisioned 4 more years under President Biden with greater crime, open borders, war with China, economic collapse. Right? And it seemed like a run-of-the-mill political attack at first glance. But, it turns out that the ad was made up of images entirely generated by AI.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, like, in this era of sort of political advertising, where there's sort of few guardrails, and just a huge potential for disinformation, should we be worried?
Well, let me say that disinformation and propaganda have been with us for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's not difficult. I was doing some work on the Civil War in England in the 1640s, and it is very easy to find woodcuts which are basically propaganda. So they show these atrocities being committed by various different sides in the Civil War, and presumably these were circulated to local people, and they believed that these atrocities were taking place. So it's not a new phenomenon to invent images, and indeed for governments to ask us to imagine worst case scenarios and show us pictures and images and text that communicates those radical scenarios or those dystopian scenarios. So I don't think that's new. I think that what's interesting about it is how easy it is now to both produce and distribute those things. So this used to be something, this promotion or creation of disinformation material used to be something that, really that was time consuming, and that really only elites had the correct networks or efficient networks through which they could force this material. And that's not true now. It is very easy to put things on social media which are false, and to get stories going, very, very quickly. Now, by the same token, it's also relatively easy to fact check those things. And I think if people, citizens can relatively quickly find out by Googling, the truth behind a story in a way that wasn't possible when I was young. It was hard maybe to dissuade people of these things. So I would just sound a note of caution at the idea that either these threats are completely novel in human existence — I don't believe that they are — or that that they are uniquely pernicious now, because I also think that there are ways to combat these things which perhaps didn't exist in the past.
Two thoughts on that. On the one hand, it almost seems like a good thing that it's much easier to make these ads, right? I mean, you can use these AI tools and, all this generative AI stuff, and you can create stuff which you would have required sort of in the Mad Men world.
Yeah.
You would have had to go to Madison Avenue and pay a lot of money. So so part of what you were saying was that, well, it's a good thing because it sort of lowers the sort of barrier to entry of providing information, right? So that's a good thing. On the other hand, the other part of what you said was, well, disinformation's been around us, for a long time. But I guess what's different now is that it is, it used to be sort of broadcast, right? You had a political campaign. There was an ad and said paid for by RNC or paid for by blah, right? So you stood behind that ad, right? Whereas now that's all sort of gone under the radar, right? It's all sort of narrow cast, right? So in sort of broadcast, they're reaching you, Arthur, directly with a message that's like tuned to you, right? And we're already seeing this in our, in ads being sort of personalized to you, right? And that part of it just smells dangerous to me. It smells of, manipulation that, you don't stand a chance, Arthur.
Yeah. Well, so I think, again, the history of technology is that we get nervous when technology becomes more democratic, right? So in the sense that when costs to use it fall, we become very anxious. And I remember in my early career, there was this explosion of blogging, and it was thought that, blogging would be a real threat to news media. I think it turned out not to be in practice. There were other threats to news media to do with, other economic circumstances that have meant that, there are fewer news sources now, especially locally. But that democratization, I think, frankly, I think it's a vital part of progress. And yes, it brings some dangers, but the idea that, that any citizen can communicate relatively easily, and as you say, can be creative, albeit politically, even in a way that I suppose could be dangerous or it could be dishonest, I think is a good thing. Just in terms of this claim about the narrowness of media appeals. So at NYU, I have these colleagues and they work specifically on social media. They do excellent work trying to understand how segmented that market is, how narrow those appeals are, and so on. And the question that I always had for them is, why should we be concerned? So in particular, notice that people seem to like very narrow media. So they seem to get a lot of utility from not watching some very broad-based news service, I don't know, like the World Service, BBC or something like this. They enjoy something that's more catered to their tastes, like Fox News, and they do this in every aspect of their media consumption. The radio shows they listen to, the types of particular shows they watch on Netflix or HBO, or the fictional shows they watch. And it is not immediately obvious to me that we should do something about their news consumption if they appear to be enjoying what they're watching. Or at least I think that is a somewhat subtle debate, whether we should be regulating news and telling people that it should be more difficult to produce these types of narrow TV shows, either on the left or the right, because we think voters should be having a more varied media diet. And I will also say that certainly in the UK at least, newspapers were extremely niche. So they focused on different parts of the ideological spectrum from left to right, and historically there were always more newspapers on the right, but still they focused on different aspects of that media spectrum, and nobody had a problem with that. And so I'm skeptical about claims that it's a problem in the broader media environment.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I see your point. So what do you think of the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal? Do you think that was real? Do you think it was overblown? Do you think, was there ample evidence for either position, on the two extremes?
So I don't know that much about the Cambridge Analytica scandal or where it is now. I think that it is not surprising to me at all that politicians would seek to use information that they have or information networks that they have to do targeting of voters. And they have always done this. So this is not a new phenomenon. And so to argue that it is in special need of regulation, and again, I'm not talking about the Cambridge Analytica case specifically, but to argue that it's in special need of regulation is fine, but I guess you need to make very distinct arguments as to why it's particularly pernicious now. Targeting has always been something that politicians and indeed industry firms have done, and it is not obvious to me that unless they are actively breaking the law to obtain the information, that this is either a new or a unique threat. I'll put it that way.
What does the data tell us so far? You referred to your colleagues at NYU. There's plenty of other people who've been looking at various kinds of data, social media data, political advertising. What does the data tell us so far? And I know this is a really difficult question to answer because it depends on the question you're asking and how you look at the data. But what have we learned in the last, 5 to 8 years, since big data sort of, came into existence and people really started analyzing it seriously?
Well, I think one thing we've learned is that, at least in the US, parties have certainly not been slow to use the data that's available to them to do targeting, and there is a whole industry around providing very micro-focused data to parties so that they can campaign appropriately. I think that we are learning more and more about so an area that I worked in was is looking at government records, so what governments choose to keep censored and what they don't. And in general, the US government probably censors in some sense much more data than it should. It is very slow at releasing that data to the public, misses various deadlines for releasing it. I think we've learned that companies that we interact with regularly keep a lot of data on us, and it is unclear whether voter consumers, they seem to be aware that these companies are gathering lots of data on them, but that they are not overly perturbed by it, or not enough to sort of quit using social media and quit using these various services that are gathering so much information about them.
So when you say that the U.S. government censors more data than it should, what do you mean by that?
So let's take something like, diplomatic records. I worked on an NSF project where it was called the Freedom of Information Archive, and we were trying to provide data to researchers in the United States about various things to do with diplomatic communication. So cables and diplomatic records that have been sent from, say, some embassy to Washington, D.C. and so on. And a feature of these records is that every few years, some should be declassified such that they can go into the public domain, and so researchers can read them and learn about the US and its history. It's a very reasonable thing that I think citizens would like to do. We know that in a sense, there is a lot of overclassification. So things are kept confidential or secret. There are various different categories, which probably should not be, as in they are not particularly secret or confidential, and they could be released. But we also know that declassification is very slow. So it is routinely the case that things should be declassified more quickly, such that researchers have access, and they take a very, very long time to get into the public domain. Now, you may say, well, who cares? This is just some academics, some historians, or some political scientists who won't get access to some data that they need or something like this. But I think it's very important in general that governments are responsive to their citizens, and part of that is making sure that records are available to citizens, and that freedom of information requests are dealt with efficiently. Indeed, I have many colleagues in political science who regularly, my understanding is they regularly request records about policing, and they find that government agencies are perhaps not as accommodating as they would hope in releasing these records, and that makes these things very hard to study.
Are they afraid of what people will find when they release the records?
I don't
especially
know.
when it comes to policing.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know if it's a political decision. It may be simply a resource decision. It is non-trivial to find some of these files or some of this information. Maybe it's politically embarrassing. Perhaps it's just costly, and that they would prefer to be doing something else. But nonetheless, it is hard to make improvements in any aspect of governing unless you make data available to researchers so they have it.
So, Arthur, I want to come back to a point you were talking about earlier about, whether there's any need to be concerned or regulate, this sort of emerging space of AI. I bring this up in the context of deep fakes, which, since it's so easy and inexpensive to make these now, there have been stories in the Indian press, for example, of women politicians, having their faces attached to, unsavory kind of material, and the stuff sort of being made available.
Yeah.
And, with evidence pointing to, one of the major political parties, having trolls that do this kind of stuff, right? Now, there are no laws against trolls, right? Trolling is not illegal, right? It's permissible.
Yeah.
And I sort of recognize the need to be really careful in, putting constraints or curbs on, people's freedom to do anything.
Yeah.
But when do we get to the point where this really becomes a problem, right? I mean, what would it take to have like anti-trolling laws or something like that come into the picture? And I mean, this is getting to be a long question, so excuse me for it, but some of this just depends on the norms of a society.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That in the US, maybe that would be harder to sort of get away with.
Yeah. I'm not a legal scholar in any sense. I will say that in the UK, at least, certain speech acts which are, per se offensive, especially as they affect more marginalized groups in society, are in fact regularly investigated and prosecuted by authorities. This is less so the case in the US, is my sense, because of particularly, strong First Amendment rights, which I tend, in fact, to be very sympathetic to. I get very anxious about the idea of the state prosecuting for speech and speech acts. I think it can lead to some very, shall we say, unintended consequences. Whether it should be illegal to produce deep fakes or not, I'm not sure. I'm skeptical. I think that I put deep fakes in the category, in some sense, of just artistic creation with AI, as in, that is to say, deep fakes need not be offensive per se, and so I'm a bit skeptical about regulation. I think that governments are often very clumsy when it comes to creativity and censorship, and I'm nervous about giving governments too much power over that space. But I think I would be surprised if we do not see some attempt, especially in countries which already investigate and prosecute, very actively prosecute speech that's offensive, that we don't see some movement in this space. Yeah.
So, but I guess what I hear you saying is that you're comfortable that the courts can sort these things out on a case-by-case basis.
Some speech may need to be regulated. I acknowledge that. Certain things to do with national security, and of course, defamation, certain things to do with defamation. But I will say that if you're asking me personally where I draw the line, I think that robust political discussion and robust discussion of political elites is incredibly important for society, and I am very nervous about governments seeking to actively regulate that space in terms of what one is allowed to say about politics, about the political process, and yes, about individual politicians. If the question is, am I more anxious about governments using these tools to overregulate their population, using high surveillance, high, AI tools to overregulate their populations, versus am I nervous about citizens using these tools to subvert the state in some reason, I would say I'm much more nervous about government surveillance and use of the tools to surveil their populations.
And is that because of the evidence so far, or is it because it's just inherently more risky?
It's not particularly, because of the evidence, though I have read some work from colleagues who, say, study China, for example. But it's more that I feel just inherently that part of a robust political process is that people, citizens, should have some leeway and predictability in terms of their ability to criticize the state and criticize politicians, and yes, criticize institutions more broadly in society, and in some sense to be offensive. I think that I understand the motivation to want to, by governments, to want to prosecute offensive speech, but I am very anxious in general about those moves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were speaking, it reminded me of a conversation I had with James Robinson, who's a co-author of Why Nations Fail and then The Narrow Corridor. He talks about state capacity, which you also referred to, which I want to actually come back to as one of your interests. And he has a sort of framework, where you have state capacity, or rather maybe state power on the y-axis and people power on the x-axis, right? And he says that a robust state is one where both have power.
Yes, I agree with that.
And that sort of is the hallmark of like robust democracy. And I was reminded of this because I think what you're saying is that you need to go far on the x-axis, that is, give people the power to, pretty much say anything they want.
Yes, yeah.
And then, have the state also have capacity. And it's almost like state capacity almost depends on sort of shackling the state, right? And I'm using shackling the Leviathan in a positive sense, right? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? That when you say you're concerned about sort of the state's ability to force itself, you're basically saying you need to put shackles around what the state is allowed to do.
Yes, well, I think, for example, that we should be very skeptical about denying, or states in particular, denying access to various AI tools for its citizenry, or whatever. I become very nervous about proposals that say it will be very difficult for researchers to be allowed to build large language models, and that this will be something that states will choose a few favored firms who will be allowed to do it. I'm very it just inherently makes me very nervous, and I would, yes, that's not to say there should be no regulation. It's to say that I think I'm suspicious of governments in this space. Yes.
So what is it that, as when you put on your political science hat, what is it that policymakers need to understand about AI and this emerging technology and this space of pre-trained language models or vision models and things like that? What is it that they fundamentally need to understand about this new technology? Or is it no different from previous ones?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure. So I have worked with LLMs myself a little bit. So firstly, LLMs, are the way I view it is that they are a tool, right? So whether they will lead to this, another industrial revolution is unclear to me. And certainly I don't think in their present state they will, but maybe some of the technologies that we're working on will help. But it seems to me the most optimistic case is that they can perhaps relieve us of some drudgery, some certain types of generation of text will help free up resources to do more interesting things, and we should just be aware that they exist and can do these things. What I'm nervous about in general is states seeking to regulate in nascent areas and somehow killing off what could be useful innovations. or having preferred firms who are allowed to do these innovations and other people who are not. This picking of favorites makes me, a bit nervous. I don't know about states, but what I will talk a little bit about as an academic is how I have observed the past year or so play out on college campuses with large language models. About a year, 18 months ago, something like this, we started to see things like, GPT-3 and ChatGPT be available for almost anyone to use. And initially, there was a lot of skepticism from college professors that, these things were any threat to the standard business model on campuses. And they would say things like, oh, but what the text that these things produce is not very plausible, it's not very academic, it makes mistakes, which was true of the early generation models. But I have seen a sudden shift, a welcome shift, to realizing the capacity of these models. So what I think we're going to see is two phases. In the first phase, and it is happening now, when it's happening already at NYU and Princeton when I talk to people, we're seeing instructors recognize that certain types of assessment mechanisms don't really make sense anymore. So asking people to write essays, this is something they can plug very easily into ChatGPT or, GPT-4 or something. And it's not obviously different from a human, and it's very, very hard to grade. So what we're going to see, I think, in the short term is a movement to, more in-class exams and so on, right? So that's just an immediate change, during my career away from something which we used to really like, which was the take-home essay, to doing in-class exams. But what I suppose I'm excited about and will also take a lot of work is recognition that maybe some things that we've been teaching students, which now they can handle very easily using large language models, maybe those things aren't really worth teaching anymore, or they're just we should teach them in a different way. An example, when I started my career and we wanted to know the area under some curve for a chi-square distribution or t distribution, something like this, we would get a big book out and we would look up the degrees of freedom and we would look at what the approximation was to the integral and so on. And then maybe 25 years ago, so when I took my second or third statistics course, it could be, returned to you with sort of arbitrary precision via some computer program in a couple of seconds, right? So we don't teach people anymore to use those t-tables or those chi-square tables. And I think something similar will happen, but in a different magnitude. Now we have large language models that can write lots of code, for example, and can write, maybe flawless code. Maybe we won't think it's particularly valuable to tell students, to write certain aspects of code, because an LLM, certainly when they're in a job in 5 or 10 years' time, will be doing this kind of automatically on the back end, right? Or we won't think it's vital for them to write particularly stylistic essays, because LLMs can do that for them. And maybe that will in some ways sort of free us up to teach other things. I mean, just even in my lifetime, we've moved away from trying to teach students facts that they should just regurgitate when they get to an exam, because these facts are sort of relatively easy to look up, say. And I think that's what we're going to see with LLMs, just a change in education in terms of what we think are important skills to learn.
So how are you using LLMs in your teaching? I mean, I'm an educator as well, and, I sensed alarm among colleagues.
Yes, that's right.
And my message was, don't be alarmed. Resistance is futile.
Yes, I agree with that too, actually. Yes.
Embrace it.
Yes.
And in my class, when students ask me if they can use ChatGPT, I'm like, sure, you can use chat anything.
Yes.
Whatever's out there is free game. How are you using AI and language models in your teaching?
So that's interesting. I don't have explicit policies on my syllabus yet. I mean, I'm teaching a graduate course. But I am aware that students are already using, various code assistants from from large language models to write code in my courses. It doesn't particularly bother me because, in some sense, I think that whether they Google to find an answer to a coding question, which has always been fine with me for a take-home homework, or whether they try and do it on ChatGPT, I don't see those as particularly different. And so what it has forced me to do, which I think is good for me and for the students, is reorientate my homeworks towards checking understanding, asking them to justify why these are the correct feature selection decisions to make. It forces me to write better questions rather than asking them to reason through what would be the correct approach. Finding things which I know an LLM cannot do because it's never seen this data before or whatever it might be.
So is a better question one that ChatGPT can't answer?
Yes, I think in some sense, yes. I think that better material and better questions are things that cannot simply be plugged into ChatGPT.
So do you actually ask Chat, if you're querying an exam, would you actually run
I don't
it?
at the moment. But I would say that I try to find data examples that I know an LLM will have not seen, and that they should work with that data set and sort of try to, explain why they're doing things. Try to make students be creative, which is something that we know LLMs struggle with a bit. So try to think of a research question that could be answered with the data and show how it could be done. Now, I think it probably won't be too long before, GPT-5 or 6 or whatever is upcoming can do that type of thing too, and I'll have to sort of change again. But I think that that's actually good for instructors. It's stressful in the short term, but we will adapt. We have adapted to every other technological change. In my career, it was, there was this concern that the internet, that Google would sort of destroy the ability to teach students useful things. I don't believe that's the case. I'm sure when maybe in my parents' generation it was the invention of the portable calculator or something, was concerned this would destroy people's ability to do arithmetic or something. But technology in general, I tend to be optimistic about new technologies, and I think it encourages us to find where we as humans can exceed machines, and that's where we should be teaching.
I agree with that, although, just given the way how fast things are changing, my initial view on this like 6 months ago was, well, it means you up your game, you ask better questions, exactly. Right? But I don't know, it just seems like, it's almost like there's no place to hide. Every time you up your game, so does ChatGPT. And, it's like, I just wonder what the end game is here. Whether there's any place to hide, or whether you have this sort of oracle, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of thing, which was science fiction then, but it doesn't seem like science fiction anymore, right? That the machine is always going to grow and learn, and us humans sort of learn and we die, and then it's over, and so we are sort of an imperfect kind of an intelligence, compared to the machine.
Well, history has many examples of claims that new eras of, say, economic growth will make bread and butter politics irrelevant, right? So we will all be, claims that we will all be rich and we'll be living in a kind of technical utopia. And so these arguments over left versus right won't matter anymore. And this has turned out, time and time again to be false. So I am confident, in a cynical way, I am confident that somehow there will be politics around the implementation of these new technologies. There always has been. Sometimes it provides a new dividing line over whether it's appropriate or not to do something new technically, and we see that especially in medicine, especially with ideas about reproduction, embryos, so on and so forth, right? A new technology comes on stream and it leads to new or more intense divisions politically. It would be very surprising to me. In fact, I don't think it's plausible that we will see, widespread use of AI and it not get pulled into some sort of political discussion about what is appropriate and what is not. I'm very skeptical about utopias, or rather, I am very skeptical about apolitical utopias. we predict them all the time and they don't occur. So
what about dystopias?
So, well, I tend to be optimistic. It is possible, of course, to find technologies that you can argue have made our lives worse, right? So there is this whole argument that cell phones among adolescents, right, have made their lives more stressful, or that social media has made our lives more difficult or more unpleasant. And it's not that I don't believe those things, but I tend in general to believe that life gets better with new technology, and we may want to be careful about how we use it, how we deploy it, where we deploy it, to make sure that everyone, or the right set of people, consent to it and understand, what this technology means. But in general, technology has improved my lifetime. Has improved my life. Has enabled me to keep in touch with people who live in thousands of miles away, much more easily even than when I first came to the United States in 2003. And so I tend to be very, optimistic about.
So as a glass half full kind of guy, are you optimistic about the role of AI in the political sphere? That this is actually going to be a good thing overall? However you define that, whether it's in terms of, politicians communicating more clearly, communicating in a more directed kind of way, citizens actually getting more information, being more informed, which is the hallmark of a democracy, right? An informed citizenry. So I'm guessing that you're sort of in the camp that this is actually going to be good for people consuming political content, as well as
I tend to be very optimistic about these things. I tend to think that technology helps politicians communicate with voters. It helps voters hold politicians accountable. And I tend, that's technology in some sort of broad sense. Whether this applies specifically to AI, I'm not sure. But just as an example, obtaining government services can be very difficult for certain people, and maybe if we had, AI-fueled chatbots that can help them find the services they need, that would be good. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's a trivial application, but I am suggesting that helping, providing technologies that help people get government services would be an example of something useful that AI could do. So yes, I am optimistic about it. Just as an example, during my own lifetime, it used to be very difficult to find out how to obtain a new passport or some certificate or record you need from the state. That used to be very, very difficult to do. And now it's very easy, at least for, in the UK, it is relatively easy to renew your driving license online and renew your passport and so on and so forth, particularly when these government departments join up. This does mean, of course, that there is a larger danger of, say, a catastrophic data leak or something like that. But I think people's day-to-day lives have improved considerably. And yes, I tend to be optimistic about the future of AI in government, yeah.
I'd asked you earlier about, what does the data tell us? And when I was, talking about sort of, maybe we'll have a better informed citizenry, which is good for democracy. Is there any evidence that people are becoming better informed than they were previously? I mean, could one actually measure that in some way? Have people been measuring that? Whether people are better informed now than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago? What's the trend? Or are they less informed?
So, in the US literature, I think one way people do it is that they do these kind of knowledge banks of questions. So they ask voters factual questions about the polity, and I may be mischaracterizing that literature, but I think that it's been pretty flat. So that is to say, even though we're seeing sort of generally high levels of education, I don't think we've seen a kind of year-on-year surge in sort of political knowledge. I'm not sure about political knowledge outside of the US, in particular for the UK. I don't know what political knowledge looks like. But that's the sort of thing that people do to try and measure. They do a voter survey. They ask them, do you know who your senator is? How many branches of government are there? These types of questions. And my sense is the other thing which I think is true is that I think there is no particularly clear evidence, as I understand it, between the providing of civic education and any particular outcome.
Is that right? I actually thought that states like Colorado, which have compulsory civic education, have a higher.
Well, but it may be endogenous, right? So the types of states, which
true.
My understanding is that.
But you're not arguing for not having civics education.
I'm not arguing for decreasing it. Actually, I'm more saying that these things are not causally trivial to identify, shall we say? Exactly what the effects of these things are.
Right, but you're saying there's no evidence either way to suggest that it's going up or down.
I have not heard that it's going down.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not completely familiar with that literature, but I thought it was pretty flat. Was the story?
One of my colleagues, Jonathan Haidt, observed at some point. He was one of my early guests on this podcast series. He said something that really sort of stayed with me, which is that young people these days, most of the content they consume was produced in the last few days.
Right. Right.
He says, whereas in previous generations, most of the content we consumed, like Bugs Bunny or something like that, was actually created by the previous generation, was curated and all of that, right? And he says that now it's sort of uncurated. It's, people's awareness is what happened in the last 5 days.
Yes, yeah.
So that makes me wonder whether, does that have an effect on people's general informedness about the world and politics?
Well, I'm curious. I would assume, and you can confirm, I guess, that John would say this is generally bad because it means that we don't have these cultural touchstones with other people in our society because we're not consuming the same media content and so on. And I agree with that as a pattern. I certainly have observed it in my own lifetime. I'm in my 40s, and I noticed that I don't have the same touchstones at all with students who are in their late teens and 20s. On the other hand, I come back to this point that people consuming media that they like is generally a good thing. And I don't see that it's so different from consuming certain hobbies that you like or food or whatever it might be. I think that these things are arguing that there was some golden age, whether you're thinking about the 1990s or 1980s, 1950s, 1910s, I don't know, where there are only a few newspapers of record or there are only a few TV stations of record, I think is a very fraught and arguable philosophical position. I think that people, communities making media for themselves, which entertains themselves, is by and large a good thing. And I tend to be very, very pro democratization of making of media. I know that people have these specific concerns, about bad acts on social media, bullying or, certain negative lifestyle messages from TikTok or Instagram, whatever it might be. I understand all that, but but by and large, I think it's great that people are able to produce media for each other, and I think that the media environment today is much richer than when I was a child.
Arthur, before we wrap up, any more thoughts about AI regulation, like on LLMs?
Well, I can talk about just one very specific thing: is the speed at which this large language model question is evolving is just like nothing I've seen before in politics. So about how it should be regulated, if it should be regulated. Should we be not allowing...
You mean should large language models be regulated? Is that the question?
Yeah. So, for example, one of the things that I've been arguing for is the importance of open source language models for science, basically. And that I think it's just very bad. It will be very bad if science is compelled basically to use proprietary models which are produced by for-profit companies, and that we would not be allowed to experiment and produce open source products for the world. And it is really remarkable to just observe in real time these products changing. And initially we thought that there was one player, and it was OpenAI, and now we see Meta and DeepMind, I guess, releasing models, and it's just remarkable to watch it play out and watch politicians sort of try to deal with it.
So the question is, are you concerned about the proprietary nature of these large language models because they carry risks with them?
Yeah, I am concerned about it. I mean, I'm concerned in the sense that I'm very skeptical of people pushing proprietary language models for scientific use. That's I'll put it that way. I think that open source has been a total game changer in science for statistical software. I mean, for all sorts of software. And I would be very apprehensive. I'd be very anxious if in the large language model arena we ended up with closed models. This would be very disappointing.
But it's not unlikely, right? Just given the costs of of training these models.
Yes, but who knows? I mean, so firstly, I'll say technology often changes fast because we, there's some massive reduction in cost that we didn't anticipate or something like this, right? But I'm not an expert on those sort of processing costs, so I don't want to speak too wisely about that. But I have been pleasantly surprised that OpenAI, say, isn't the only game in town, right? So we can get Llama 2, for example, Falcon, and there are other models. I had feared that by this point there would be basically one large language model and we'd all have to use it and OpenAI would have a monopoly on it. That doesn't seem to have happened, and I'm very relieved about that. I agree that there are some bottlenecks. Not everyone is going to have the requisite processing power to produce an LLM, but I'm very optimistic that as long as we don't sort of shut down the production of open language models, that we could all benefit.
So Arthur, I always ask my academic guests what advice they have for young people these days. And some sort of duck that question, but I'm going to ask that anyway, right? As an educator, you set up the MS data science program at NYU. You took it from 0 to 60 miles an hour, or the speed limit, and it's just humming along. What advice do you have for young people in general? And then we'll talk about people thinking about data science kinds of careers.
Well, I will note that this is predicated on, of course, me no longer being young, which I acknowledge. Well, one thing I would say is that life is long.
And getting longer.
It is getting longer, that's right. Yeah. But life is long, and I think, just speaking about myself, not about other young people, when I was a young person, I was very anxious about shutting down avenues, and I had constant, I suppose, fear of missing out. And I worried a lot in my 20s that I was committing to avenues, and then I would worry that maybe I had made the wrong commitment to that avenue and that this wasn't the right thing to work on, and so on and so forth. And I would say whether it's simply the case that I got happier over my lifetime and just more confident in what I was doing, or whether in fact it did work out and that sticking to those early decisions was okay, I would just say that in general things got better. So I would say life is long, and okay, you don't want to make bad decisions early on because you have to live with them. But on the other hand, there are many surprises as you go through life, and your path is not set, and you can continue to innovate. So certainly when I was in graduate school, I would never have imagined one day having a joint appointment in data science and political science like I did at NYU, or being a DGS of a data science master's. Data science didn't exist when I was in graduate school. And that's just an example of something where things change and, anything can happen. Yeah.
I was on a TV segment last week on Yahoo Finance where they were talking to me about these eye-popping salaries of data scientists and AI people, right? And Netflix advertising positions for like $900,000, right? And the question was,
good work if you can get it.
Yeah. And the question was like, is this worth it? And I said, well, if you can get the right people, it is. It's just hard to get the right people. But the question I want to ask you is this leading to inequality, right? Where fundamentally, right, you've got people who sort of know the technology and know how to create it and work with it, are sort of the new Wall Street, kind of the way I see it, right? And so you've got these, salaries of $1 million a year, and on the other end of the spectrum, tens of thousands a year. And there's a lot more of the latter jobs, where humans are still required because the machine can't do it, right? Yeah. I mean, I was visiting Starbucks last year. I took a tech MBA class. We visited them. They were talking about how complex a barista's job is, right? And that you still need humans for that. But I can see the writing on the wall there, right? That's going to be gone and maybe replaced with other jobs that are low paying, right? So is this sort of what we're heading towards, like a society with just more inequality?
So, firstly, I think government has a legitimate role. One of its legitimate roles, maybe one of its few legitimate roles, is to work to reduce inequality. Right? That's one thing that governments do. That seems, I think, that increasing inequality will be a major issue in many societies. Do I think that there is a new class of
a new elite?
Yeah, a new tech elite. Yes, I understand that argument, actually. I understand the argument that precisely as we've just discussed in terms of something like large language models, there may be, unfortunately, sort of bottlenecks to how many can actually be built, right? And how competitive that sector can ever really be, right? And that this will encourage more inequality. In the same way that there may be sort of a natural limit to how competitive, the Amazon-style distribution world is, or the Google-style search engine world is, precisely because only one firm can have this much data and is getting more data every day. And so, yes, government has a legitimate role, I think, in attempting to reduce inequality. Not necessarily, I'm not an expert on economics at all, so not necessarily kind of breaking up these firms or anything like this, but more in terms of thinking about sort of managing the transition. But certainly I think governments will need to think about how to manage the transition to artificial intelligence, to certain types of jobs becoming, if not obsolete, then certainly worse paid. Now, of course, this isn't the first time governments have had to deal with this, and I'm not simply talking about the Industrial Revolution and having to sort of cope with changes in production. I mean, even things like exposure to trade in the United States, and this, meaning that factories move elsewhere, manufacturing is redeployed to other countries. And so I think that we will eventually see things like that, where sectors will get disturbed, will be challenged by AI, and this is something that governments will have to be on top of. And so governments need to be very thoughtful and sensitive to what's going on, and to watch carefully, what the developments, in this area. Yeah.
Arthur, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. So thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Vasant. It's great.